Listen carefully, because what you're about to hear was never meant to be remembered. Not forgotten, remembered. Beneath the quiet hills of Virginia, where the wind moves through oak trees like whispers through a graveyard, there is a house that once sat abandoned long enough for nature to begin swallowing it whole. The locals called it the Daltrey Place. Most people in Grover's Landing passed it without looking, and the few who did look looked away quickly. In the spring of 1871, a man named Thomas Hargrove rode into that valley with the kind of determination only young men possess, the belief that hard work could rebuild anything: broken wood, broken land, broken history. He bought the property cheap, too cheap. The house was collapsing inward like a body long starved of breath. Shutters hung like broken teeth. The porch leaned slightly south, as if trying to escape the hill itself. But Hargrove didn't see decay. He saw potential. Men like him always do. He told his wife Eleanor that the estate would be their legacy. He told the townspeople he would restore it to the finest home in the county. New beams, new floors, new life. But there's a rule about old land most men don't understand. The ground remembers things people choose to forget. And sometimes, when you start digging, the ground answers. 43 days into the restoration, 5 laborers were clearing debris from the cellar floor when one of them noticed something strange beneath his boot. The soil there was different, lighter, looser, not natural. The man pressed his heel down, and the ground sank slightly. Then they pried the earth up. Under the timber was timber. Under the timber was empty space. And when Thomas Hargrove lowered his lantern into the opening, he saw stone steps descending into darkness that should not have existed beneath that house. Steps that no blueprint mentioned. Steps that someone had deliberately hidden. The lantern light revealed something worse. Footprints. Not fresh ones, but the unmistakable smooth wear of a path walked hundreds, maybe thousands of times. Someone had lived down there for a long time. And at the end of the passage, 60 feet beneath the Virginia hillside, they found a brick wall, perfectly sealed, built from the inside, which means whoever closed it had something on the other side they never wanted the world to see again. And the moment Thomas Hargrove realized that, he made the first mistake every man makes when confronting buried truth. He decided to open it. And that decision would drag him and eventually the entire town into a history buried so deep that even the people who lived above it had stopped asking questions. Because some secrets don't disappear. They just wait. Waiting for the wrong man with a lantern and a shovel to wake them up.
You need to understand something before we go any deeper. Secrets like this don't begin with tunnels. They begin with men. Men who control land, money, silence, and the quiet obedience of the people around them. Grover's Landing in 1871 looked like the kind of place where nothing important had ever happened. 300 people at most, a church with a sagging roof, a blacksmith shop that smelled of coal and sweat, a single muddy road connecting the valley to the outside world. But towns like this are perfect for something darker. Isolation breeds silence. Silence breeds control. And control allows certain men to operate without ever appearing on a map. For 40 years before Thomas Hargrove arrived, one family had quietly dominated the valley, the Daltreys. Their estate sat on the best rise of land for miles, overlooking the creek and most of the farmland that fed the community. The house had been built in 1833 by the patriarch Gerald Daltrey, a man whose wealth appeared suddenly and whose past no one could quite verify. He bought land aggressively, he bought loyalty, and most importantly, he bought silence. People respected Gerald Daltrey, but they never trusted him. Men like him rarely need to raise their voices. Their authority moves through a place like weather, felt everywhere, questioned nowhere. By the 1850s, the Daltrey estate controlled nearly 300 acres. Hired laborers worked the fields year-round. Wagons came and went at odd hours, and sometimes strangers were seen near the property late at night. But in small towns, people learn an important survival instinct. They mind their own business. Then the Civil War came, and like every war, it rearranged the balance of power. Gerald Daltrey died in 1861 before the conflict fully reached the valley. His eldest son, Henry, inherited the estate, but he left soon after to fight with the Confederate Army. When he returned in 1865, the man who came home wasn't the same one who had left. Neighbors said he barely spoke. He attended church but never looked anyone in the eye. And within 4 years, he abandoned the estate house completely. Not sold, not repaired, abandoned. Henry and Aswa's wife Agnes moved into a smaller home closer to town, claiming the old house had become too expensive to maintain. Leaking roof, bad well water, shifting foundation, all practical reasons, but something about their behavior didn't match the explanation. Agnes developed a habit that locals quietly noticed. Whenever she walked past the old estate road, she refused to look toward the house. Not once, not even accidentally. Now think about that. Imagine living somewhere for decades, raising a family there, building your entire life around a piece of land, and then refusing to even glance at it. That isn't the behavior of someone who left because of repair costs. That's the behavior of someone who knows something about that land, something they don't want to remember, or worse, something they're afraid someone else might discover. And in the summer of 1871, someone finally did. Because beneath that abandoned house, under a carefully concealed layer of clay and timber, lay a tunnel no one had mentioned during the sale. A tunnel someone had gone to great lengths to hide. And at the end of that tunnel, a wall built by someone standing on the inside. Which leaves only one possibility. The people who sealed it knew exactly what they were trapping behind it, and they wanted it buried forever. But Thomas Hargrove wasn't the kind of man who left doors closed, especially doors hidden under his own house. He was about to learn a lesson every man eventually faces when chasing forbidden knowledge. Some truths aren't buried to protect the past. They're buried to protect the present. And once you start digging, the earth starts answering.
The first man to sense something was wrong wasn't Thomas Hargrove, it was old Pratt. Every town has a man like him, a man who has watched decades pass the way most people watch weather, quiet, patient, storing details nobody else notices. Old Pratt had been born in that valley before the Daltrey house even finished settling on its foundations. He had repaired roofs, laid stone walls, rebuilt barns, and buried friends in the churchyard soil. If a building had stood in Grover's Landing long enough, Pratt had probably worked on it. So when he heard the words tunnel beneath the Daltrey cellar, something old and heavy shifted behind his eyes. He didn't react immediately. Men like Pratt never do. Instead, he sat there during the midday meal, chewing slowly, watching Thomas Hargrove the way a hunter studies movement in tall grass, because he had seen that look before, the look of a man who had just stumbled onto something bigger than he understood. "You found something in the cellar," Pratt finally said. Not a question, a statement.
And the moment those words landed, the air around the table changed. Thomas hesitated just long enough for everyone to notice. Then he said it. "There's a passage under the house." 4 words, but those 4 words carried the weight of something buried for 40 years. Ned Voss leaned forward first. Rufus Tate stopped chewing entirely. The Holt brothers exchanged a quick glance, like boys who had just heard the first crack of thunder before a storm. But Pratt didn't move. He just stared out toward the northern tree line, because the direction of the tunnel mattered, and he already suspected where it pointed. "How long?" the carpenter asked. "About 60 feet, Thomas said. "Ends at a brick wall." That was the moment old Pratt's jaw tightened, just slightly. Most men would have missed it, but Thomas didn't. Pratt had lived long enough to understand something about hidden structures. Nobody builds a sealed passage underground unless the thing on the other side is more dangerous than the tunnel itself, and this one had been sealed from the inside, which meant whoever closed it had been standing inside the tunnel, facing whatever lay beyond that wall when they decided to bury it forever. Pratt took another slow sip of water. Then he said something that chilled every man sitting there. "There are stories about this property." Now here's the thing about stories in places like Grover's Landing. They don't appear in books. They travel quietly between people who trust each other just enough to whisper them. Stories about wagons moving through the valley at night. Stories about strangers who passed through but were never seen again. Stories about certain sections of land where even the animals behave differently. But the story Pratt remembered most clearly came from his father, and his father had worked the Daltrey land in the 1840s. He had told Pratt something once, many years later, after a bottle of whiskey loosened the weight of memory. He said on certain nights, when the valley was still enough to hear the creek running over stone, you could hear sounds coming from beneath the ground near the northern trees. Not animals, not water. Voices, muffled, human. Pratt had dismissed it when he was young. Men say strange things when they grow old. But now a tunnel had appeared beneath the Daltrey cellar, and it ran exactly toward those trees, toward the place his father had warned him about, which meant something very uncomfortable was beginning to form in his mind. If the tunnel connected to that spot, then someone had been moving people underground on the Daltrey property decades earlier. And if that was true, the sealed wall at the end of the passage wasn't just hiding a room, it was hiding a story powerful enough that someone had taken the time to bury it beneath brick, clay, and 40 years of silence. The kind of story that changes how a man sees the ground beneath his own feet, and Thomas Hargrove was about to open it.
The next morning, before the sun had fully burned the fog off the valley, Thomas Hargrove stood alone in the cellar with a lantern and a notebook. This is something most men never learn, but the ones who do survive longer around dangerous truths. Before you uncover something, you study it, you observe, you map the shape of the unknown before you disturb it. Thomas had spent years working around land records and property surveys. That kind of work teaches a man patience. Every acre has a story written in lines, angles, and distances, and the tunnel beneath his house was telling one. He crouched beside the opening where the workers had lifted the clay and timber. The lantern light flickered against rough stone steps descending into the earth like the throat of something ancient. The air coming from below felt colder than the cellar itself, not the chill of wind, the stillness of a place that had been sealed for years. Thomas lowered himself carefully down the steps. Each footfall echoed softly through the narrow passage, the sound swallowed by packed earth and stone. The walls were rough but deliberate, dry-laid rock for the first section, then timber supports reinforcing the ceiling further down. Whoever built it had known exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a crude hiding hole. This was engineering. The floor was worn smooth down the center, not deeply, but enough to show repeated travel.
Lantern light revealed the faint curve of countless footsteps compressed into the soil over time. People had passed through here, not once, many times. Thomas moved slowly, counting his steps the way a surveyor counts distance, 30 feet, 40, 50. Then the passage ended. The brick wall stood in front of him like a deliberate act of silence. He raised the lantern closer. The bricks were uniform, kiln-fired, carefully mortared, but the detail that caught his attention immediately was the finish of the mortar lines. They faced him. That meant the wall had been built from the opposite side. The mason had stood beyond the opening, laying bricks backward, sealing the tunnel while facing whatever space existed behind it. That detail mattered. A man closing a passage normally works from the side he intends to keep open, but this one had been closed from the far side, which meant whoever built it didn't want anyone coming through the tunnel ever again. Thomas pressed his hand against the brick. Cold, solid. But Rufus Tate had been right about one thing when they examined it earlier. There was hollow space behind it. You could feel it in the way the sound traveled when you tapped the wall. A dull echo returned through the bricks, like knocking on the side of a wooden crate. Thomas stood there longer than he realized, because in that moment something quiet but powerful moved through his thoughts. Not fear, recognition. Every man eventually reaches a moment where he understands he is standing on the edge of a truth bigger than himself, and the next choice determines whether he walks away or steps forward. Thomas lifted the lantern higher and studied the wall again. The mortar looked newer than the tunnel itself. 10 years, maybe 15, which meant the passage had existed long before someone decided to seal it. Built first, closed later. That meant the real story wasn't the wall. The real story was the years before it. Years when the tunnel had been open. Years when people had walked through this narrow corridor under the Daltrey house, moving toward whatever space waited on the other side. Thomas turned slowly and looked back down the tunnel toward the cellar stairs. Above him, his wife and daughter slept peacefully in a house they believed was simply old and neglected. Above him, men in town went about their lives believing the Daltrey estate was just another abandoned farm. But under their feet, there was a buried system someone had designed carefully enough to remain hidden for decades. And that meant only one thing. This tunnel had a purpose. Not storage, not architecture. Movement. Hidden movement. Which raises a question most men would rather avoid asking. Who was moving through it, and who was hunting him? Because if old Pratt's father had been right, those sounds under the earth weren't echoes. They were people. And if the tunnel truly ended beneath the northern trees, then the Daltrey estate had once sat directly on one of the most dangerous secret pathways in American history, a path men killed to protect and others died trying to follow. But Thomas Hargrove still didn't know that yet. All he knew was that there was a room behind that wall, and whatever waited inside it had been buried there for a reason.
Thomas Hargrove did something that separated him from most men who stumble into buried history. He waited. Not long, but long enough to think. 3 days. 3 full days passed before anyone touched the brick wall again. During that time, Thomas walked the land above the tunnel repeatedly, tracing the direction of the passage the way a hunter tracks an animal through brush. If the underground corridor ran straight north, as he believed, it should emerge somewhere near the old cedar grove at the base of the slope. He searched the ground carefully. Broken soil, loose stone, old doors, hidden cellar entrances, anything. But the forest floor looked untouched. Decades of leaves layered the ground like a quiet burial. If there was another entrance, it had been hidden just as carefully as the one beneath the cellar. That thought troubled him more than the tunnel itself, because hidden entrances require planning. Planning requires intent. And intent means someone had once used that passage for something important enough to risk discovery. Meanwhile, the men working on the property felt the tension growing. Even if Thomas hadn't told them everything, Men can sense when a place is holding its breath. Ned Voss sharpened tools that didn't need sharpening. Rufus Tate kept glancing toward the cellar doors. The Holt brothers whispered constantly when they thought no one could hear. But old Pratt remained silent, watching, thinking. On the third morning, Thomas approached him while the others worked on the porch beams. "I need to ask you something directly," Thomas said. Pratt looked up slowly. "You ever hear the name Cornelius Webb?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the old man's expression changed in a way that was almost invisible unless you knew how to look. Recognition. Not surprise. Recognition. That alone told Thomas something important. Pratt hadn't expected the question, but he had expected the name to surface eventually. "You've been digging through the county records," Pratt said quietly. Thomas nodded. "I found a land transfer from 1854, a man named Cornelius Webb, free man of color, mason and carpenter, worked the Daltrey estate for years." Pratt stared at the distant tree line for a long moment before answering. "My father knew him." That sentence carried weight, because in 1850s Virginia, relationships like that were complicated, dangerous, and rarely recorded honestly. "What kind of man was he?" Thomas asked. Pratt rubbed his weathered hands together slowly. "Quiet," he said. "Careful. One of those men who spoke only when words mattered." Then he added something that shifted the air between them. He understood things about the valley most folks didn't. Thomas waited, because Pratt clearly wasn't finished. "My father used to say Webb had hands that could build anything, stone, wood, whatever you gave him. Said he could shape a wall so clean you'd swear it grew there naturally." Thomas thought about the tunnel, the precise timber framing, the stonework, the hidden structure beneath the house. "And he worked on the Daltrey property for years?" Thomas asked. "Long time. Long enough to know every inch of that land." Then Pratt said something that turned the quiet morning suddenly colder. "My father also said Webb was involved in something that required moving people quietly through the valley." Thomas felt the pieces beginning to shift. Because if Cornelius Webb knew the terrain, and if he had the skill to build hidden structures, and if he had been trusted enough to work directly under Gerald Daltrey's nose, then a possibility began forming that carried enormous implications. The tunnel beneath the estate might not have been built by the Daltreys at all. It might have been built despite them, which meant the sealed wall at the end of the passage wasn't just hiding a room. It might be hiding evidence of an underground operation that had once existed beneath one of the most powerful properties in the valley. An operation that someone later discovered and violently shut down. Thomas looked toward the cellar doors. He could feel it now. That pull. The same pull men feel when they sense a hidden mechanism in history, something buried beneath the official story. And the deeper you go, the more dangerous it becomes. Because buried systems always served someone. The question is whether they served power or escaped it. And behind that brick wall, the truth was waiting. The decision was made on a Friday. Not officially, no vote, no declaration, just a quiet understanding between men who had already crossed the line between curiosity and responsibility. Because once you know something might be buried beneath your feet, walking away becomes impossible. That morning, the sky over the valley was pale gray, the kind of color that makes the hills look older than they are. Thomas arrived early, long before the other workers, and unlocked the cellar doors himself. The air down there felt heavier than usual. Maybe it always had. Maybe now he was just paying attention. One by one, the others joined him. Ned Voss, Rufus Tate, the Holt brothers, and finally old Pratt
descending the stairs slower than the rest, carrying a lantern in his thick hands. 5 men, 5 lanterns, 5 shadows stretching along the tunnel walls as they walked toward the brick barrier. Rufus studied the wall carefully before anyone touched it. He was a mason, which meant he understood the language of stone and mortar the way musicians understand sound. He tapped the bricks gently with the butt of his hammer, listened, tapped again, then crouched to examine the mortar seams. "This wasn't built quick," he said finally. Thomas waited. "Whoever sealed it took their time," Rufus continued. "Mortar's clean, bricks are aligned proper, no panic in the work." That observation mattered, because rushed walls look different. Crooked lines, uneven mortar, hands shaking with urgency. This wall had been constructed with calm precision, which meant the man building it hadn't been running from danger. He had been executing a decision. "Could it be structural?" asked Ned. Rufus shook his head. "Not likely. Tunnel stood fine before the wall went up." "Then why seal it?" Abel asked. No one answered, because the obvious answer was the one nobody wanted to say aloud. Something on the other side needed to stay buried. Rufus stood up and rolled his shoulders once. "Best start from the top," he said. The first brick came loose after several careful strikes of the hammer. Mortar cracked softly. Dust drifted down in thin gray ribbons. The sound echoed through the tunnel in a way that made every man suddenly aware of how deep underground they were. Brick by brick, the wall began to open, each piece stacked neatly against the tunnel wall. Slow, methodical. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. The opening grew large enough for lantern light to pass through. And that's when they smelled it. Not rot, not death, something older. The smell of a space closed for decades, where time itself had settled into the air. Damp earth, dry timber, and beneath it, a strange mineral stillness. Ned was the first to lean forward with his lantern. He froze, completely still. "What?" asked Thomas. Ned didn't answer immediately. Instead, he raised the lantern slightly higher and spoke in a voice quieter than anyone had ever heard from him. "There's a room." Those 4 words sent a current through the tunnel. Rufus removed another brick carefully, then another. The opening widened, lantern light spilled through, and slowly the shape of the hidden chamber began to reveal itself. A rectangular space carved directly from the earth, timber beams bracing the ceiling, shelves along one wall, and across from them 3 low wooden platforms, beds, roughly built but unmistakable, sleeping platforms, small, cramped, built by someone who needed to hide people for long periods of time. The realization settled over the men like cold water. Someone had lived down here, not briefly, not by accident, for weeks, maybe months, maybe longer. Thomas stepped forward and held his lantern through the opening. Dust floated through the beam of light like suspended years. On the shelves were objects still resting exactly where they had been left. A clay water jug, a folded cloth, something that looked like a small book, and beside it, a child's jacket. The fabric faded and stiff with age, but clearly meant for someone no older than 7 or 8. No one spoke, because in that moment something powerful happened in each man standing in that tunnel. They stopped seeing the room as architecture and started seeing it as a place where human beings had once waited in silence, hoping not to be discovered. And suddenly the tunnel beneath the Daltrey estate wasn't just a structure, it was a story someone had tried to erase. But the wall was almost gone now, and once the last bricks fell, There would be no putting that story back underground.
The last row of bricks came down slowly. Rufus insisted on that. Not because the wall mattered anymore, but because the men standing in that tunnel had begun to feel something they hadn't expected when the day started. Respect. Respect for whoever had lived in that room long before any of them were born. When the final brick slid free and settled into Rufus's hands, the opening was large enough for a man to crawl through. Thomas didn't hesitate. That tells you something about him. Some men would have paused at the threshold. Some would have waited for another man to go first. But there's a certain kind of personality, rare, dangerous, and useful, that steps into darkness simply because the truth might be there. Thomas ducked under the timber beam and stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately, not dramatically, but enough that the shift felt real on his skin. The chamber was deeper than it had appeared through the lantern gap, about 30 feet long and 20 wide, carved into the hillside with a precision that spoke of months of labor. The ceiling beams were old but still solid. Someone had built this place to last. His lantern light moved across the room slowly. The shelves came first, 3 wooden planks supported by rough brackets driven into the earthen wall. On them sat the objects Ned had spotted earlier: the clay jug, a wooden comb worn smooth by years of use, and the small leather-bound book. Thomas reached for the book first, not carefully at first, just instinctively. But the moment his fingers touched the cover, he felt the stiffness of old leather swollen by decades of trapped moisture. That forced him to slow down. This thing had survived underground for years. Handled wrong, it might crumble. He opened it gently. Inside were pages filled with handwriting, tight, precise, each letter formed slowly, as if the writer had learned that every word mattered. Thomas could only make out fragments in the lantern light, names, dates, places, but one detail struck him immediately. The writing was deliberate, almost formal. This wasn't a diary written casually. It was a record, a testimony. He closed it carefully and set it back down. Then he moved toward the folded cloth beside the jug. When he unfolded it, the room went even quieter. A woman's headscarf, faded, almost gray with time. Beneath it lay the child's jacket, small, hand-sewn. Thomas held it in both hands, feeling the brittle fabric crack softly at the folds. 7 years old, maybe? 8 at most? A child had slept in this room. A child had hidden here underground. That thought changed something in the men standing in the tunnel behind him. You could feel it, because suddenly the chamber wasn't abstract anymore. It had faces, people, breathing, waiting, hoping not to be found. Thomas turned back toward the shelves. One object remained, a folded sheet of paper wedged carefully between the jug and the wall. It looked fragile enough to disintegrate if opened wrong, so he unfolded it slowly. The paper held, barely. The writing on it was different from the book. Larger, more urgent, charcoal instead of ink. Some words had smeared into shadows across the fold lines, but the first line remained clear enough to read. Thomas read it once, then again. The words hit him like a quiet hammer. He stood there in the center of the hidden chamber, lantern shaking slightly in his hand, while the others watched his face. Finally, Ned spoke. "What does it say?" Thomas didn't answer right away. Because when you encounter something written by someone who believed they might disappear, the words carry a different weight. He folded the paper carefully again. Then he looked at the men around him. "It says," he began slowly, "we were here." The sentence hung in the air, but he wasn't finished. He opened the paper again and read the second line. "If you find this," Thomas's voice lowered slightly, "remember us." Silence filled the room so completely that for a moment you could hear the faint creak of the house far above them. 5 men standing beneath 40 years of earth, holding proof that people had once hidden under that land,
people who knew they might vanish without a trace and left a message for whoever discovered them, not begging, not pleading, just asking one thing: remember us. That was the moment the discovery stopped being a curiosity. It became a responsibility, because buried truth does something powerful to the men who uncover it. It forces them to decide whether they will bury it again or bring it into the light. And Thomas Hargrove hadn't even begun to understand how dangerous that decision was about to become.
For several minutes, no one spoke. The lanterns burned quietly, their light moving slowly across the earthen walls as the men shifted their weight. Dust drifted in the air like tiny ghosts that had been waiting decades to see light again. Thomas kept staring at the paper. "We were here. If you find this, remember us." Those weren't the words of someone expecting rescue. Those were the words of someone preparing to disappear. Old Pratt finally stepped through the opening in the wall and into the chamber. The timber beam creaked slightly as his broad shoulders passed beneath it. He walked slowly around the room, examining everything without touching it. The beds, the shelves, the narrow ventilation shaft in the far corner that none of the others had noticed yet, a small tunnel angled upward toward the surface, barely wide enough for air to pass through. Whoever built this place had thought about survival, carefully. "This wasn't just hiding," Pratt said quietly. Thomas looked at him. "What do you mean?" Pratt gestured around the room. "Look at the spacing. 3 beds, supplies, air shaft. Whoever built this expected people to stay down here for days, maybe longer." The Holt brothers shifted uneasily. "Why would anyone need to hide underground that long?" Abel asked. But the answer had already started forming in everyone's mind. Thomas picked up the leather book again. "Let's find out." He carried it carefully to the largest wooden platform and sat down, brushing away decades of dust before opening the first page. The handwriting inside was neat and steady. At the top of the page was a date: October 3rd, 1856. Thomas read silently for a few seconds. Then his expression changed. "What is it?" Ned asked. Thomas looked up. "This isn't a diary," he said. He turned the book slightly so the others could see the page. "It's a list." Names filled the page, dozens of them, some with notes beside them, some with simple check marks, some with a single word written next to them: safe. The next page had more names, then another and another, each entry carefully written, each one representing a person who had passed through that hidden chamber. Rufus stepped closer. "How many?" Thomas flipped through the pages slowly. "More than 100. That number hung in the air like thunder waiting to break, because 100 people don't pass through a hidden underground chamber by accident. That requires organization, planning, a network. Pratt nodded slowly, as if something long suspected had finally been confirmed. "My father was right," he murmured. Thomas looked up. "About what?" Pratt pointed at the book. "About people moving through this valley." The Holt brothers exchanged nervous glances. "You're saying this was some kind of hiding place?" Eli asked. Thomas shook his head slowly. "No." He tapped the list of names with his finger. "This wasn't the destination." He turned another page. More names, more check marks, more notes written in the careful hand of someone who understood the importance of records. Then he found a line that made him stop. Next to one name was written something different. Not safe, not a check mark, a short phrase. Thomas read it aloud. "Moved north, river crossing." Old Pratt exhaled slowly. Now he was certain. "That wasn't just a hiding room," he said. "That was a station." The word settled into the minds of the other men. Station. Not shelter. Not prison. Part of a route. A hidden route. And suddenly the tunnel beneath the Daltrey estate began to make sense in a way none of them had expected. Because if people had been passing through here and leaving toward the river,
then the Daltrey property might have once been part of something far larger than the valley itself, something that stretched across counties, across states, maybe even across the entire country. Thomas closed the book slowly. "You know what that means, don't you?" No one answered immediately, but they all felt the weight of the same realization. This room had once been part of a secret system that moved people in silence, people who needed to vanish, people whose names had been carefully written down so someone, somewhere would know they had survived. And if that was true, then the person who built this chamber, the person who kept these records, the person who risked everything to hide strangers beneath this house, was almost certainly the same man Thomas had asked Pratt about days earlier, the mason who knew every inch of this land, the man whose skills could carve rooms out of earth and stone, Cornelius Webb. But that raised a darker question, because if Webb had built this place to save people, why had someone later sealed the tunnel with a brick wall? Why had the room been buried? And why had the Daltrey family abandoned the estate only a few years later? There was only one explanation that made sense. At some point, someone powerful had discovered what was happening under their land, and when they didn't just shut it down, they erased it. Which meant the room they were standing in wasn't just a relic of courage, it was also a crime scene. And the deeper they looked into that book of names, the closer they would come to discovering exactly what happened here 40 years earlier. A truth someone tried very hard to bury.
The moment the word station entered the room, the air seemed to change. Not because the men suddenly understood everything, but because they understood enough. Thomas flipped through the book again, more carefully this time. Each page followed the same pattern, a name, sometimes an age, sometimes a small note beside it. Some pages had only 2 or 3 names, others had 10. But the pattern that truly caught his attention was the spacing between dates. October 1856, then November, then January. People had come through here in waves, small groups, spread out over time, which meant this room hadn't been used once, it had been used repeatedly, over years. Whoever kept this record, Thomas said quietly, was tracking the movement of people. Escaping, Ned corrected. Thomas nodded. Escaping. That word carried a very specific meaning in 1850s Virginia, because 10 miles south of the valley ran a road used by slave patrols, and north of the river, freedom. Old Pratt leaned against one of the beams, his lantern hanging low. "My father said there were men in this valley who quietly helped travelers at night," he said. "Travelers?" Rufus asked. Pratt looked at him. That's the polite word they used. Everyone understood what he meant. In the years before the Civil War, people escaping slavery often moved through hidden networks of safe houses and secret routes, places where they could hide for a night, maybe 2, before moving further north. The system didn't have official leaders. It survived through trust, through quiet cooperation, through ordinary people who decided the law wasn't always the same thing as justice. And sometimes those places were called stations. Thomas turned another page. This one was different. Instead of names, there was a small sketch, a map. Crude, but clear enough. The Daltrey house, the cedar grove, the creek, and a line heading north toward the river crossing Pratt had mentioned earlier. "This is the route," Thomas said. Rufus stepped closer. "You think Webb drew that?" "Had to be him," Pratt said. "Only man around here with the skill to build this place." Thomas studied the map carefully. There were marks along the route, 3 of them, small circles, each labeled with initials, possible safe houses, possible meeting points, which meant this valley hadn't just hosted one hidden chamber. It had been part of a chain, a living network that had once stretched through the countryside. Thomas closed the book slowly. "You realize what this means," he said. Ned scratched his beard. It means people were helping slaves escape. More than that, Thomas replied. It means the Daltrey estate was sitting directly on top of the operation. That statement made the Holt brothers uneasy. "Hold on," Eli said. "You're saying the Daltreys were helping run this?" Thomas shook his head. "No." And that was the truly dangerous possibility. What if the Daltreys weren't involved? What if Cornelius Webb had built the tunnel secretly, right under the nose of one of the most powerful families in the valley, using their land to move fugitives north? If that were true, then eventually someone in the Daltrey household would have discovered it, and when they did, everything would have changed. Thomas looked again at the brick wall they had just dismantled, carefully constructed, sealed from the inside of the chamber, which meant someone had stood in this very room while closing the passage, someone who wanted to ensure the tunnel could never be used again. Pratt voiced the thought everyone was circling. What if the Daltreys found out? Silence followed, because that would explain several things at once: the sealed wall, the abandoned house, the sudden disappearance of Cornelius Webb from local records. Thomas flipped back through the book quickly, scanning the names again. Webb stopped writing in 1859. Frowned. What happened that year? Everyone in the room knew the answer. Tension over slavery had reached a breaking point across the country. Raids, rebellions, crackdowns, slave catchers becoming more aggressive, and landowners becoming more suspicious of anyone helping fugitives escape. If the Daltreys had discovered the hidden station in 1859, they wouldn't have quietly ignored it. Helping runaways was considered a serious crime, punishable by prison, sometimes worse, which meant the sealed chamber might not only be the remains of a secret rescue network, it might be the last place Cornelius Webb ever worked, or hid, or fought to protect the people he was helping. Thomas looked around the room again. The beds, the shelves, the child's jacket, a quiet refuge built for people risking everything for a chance of freedom. And suddenly the brick wall made a chilling kind of sense, because if someone powerful had discovered this place, they might not just shut it down. They might bury it, seal it, erase every trace, and make sure the man responsible disappeared along with it. Thomas closed the record book one final time. "We need to find out what happened to Webb," he said. Old Pratt nodded slowly, but there was something uneasy in his eyes. "Careful, son," he said. Thomas looked up. Pratt gestured toward the chamber around them. "Whoever buried this place 40 years ago didn't want it found." He paused. "And men who go digging into old secrets." His lantern light flickered across the brick dust and the dark tunnel behind them. "Sometimes discover the reason they were buried."
That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The house above the tunnel had the kind of quiet only old buildings possess. Wood beams settled slowly as the temperature dropped. The wind moved along the outer walls like fingers brushing dry leaves. Normally, those sounds meant nothing. But once a man knows there's a hidden chamber beneath his floorboards, every sound begins to feel different. Thomas sat at the kitchen table with the leather record book open in front of him. The lantern burned low beside it. Page after page of names, some written carefully, some squeezed into the margins as if time had been running out. He ran his finger down one of the columns. Sarah, age 24, safe. James, age 11, safe. Eliza, age unknown, moved north. Then there were entries without notes, just names, dozens of them. That detail bothered him more than anything, because when someone keeps a record this carefully, missing information usually means something interrupted the process, something sudden, something final. The last page held only 3 names, and below them, blank paper. No closing note, no explanation, just the quiet end of the list.
Thomas leaned back slowly. If Cornelius Webb had been documenting the people passing through the station, he had clearly intended to continue, but he hadn't, which meant something had stopped him, suddenly, violently. A floorboard creaked behind him. Thomas turned. Eleanor stood in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl. "You're still awake," she said softly. Thomas closed the book halfway. "I didn't mean to wake you." She stepped closer, her eyes moving toward the pages. "You've been staring at that thing for hours." He hesitated. Then he slid the book toward her. "Read a few names." She did. Her brow slowly tightened. "These are people?" "Yes." "Who wrote it?" "Man named Cornelius Webb." She turned another page. More names, more notes, more lives carefully recorded. "What is this?" she whispered. Thomas answered quietly. "A ledger of people escaping slavery." Eleanor looked up sharply. "Here?" "Yes." "Under our house?" Thomas nodded. She sat down slowly across from him. "That means—" she began. "Yes," he said. "It means the property used to be part of a route north." The realization moved through her face the same way it had moved through the workers earlier that day. Shock, then something deeper. Understanding. "These people were hiding here," she said. "For a night, maybe two. And then they kept moving. North? Toward the river." Eleanor closed the book carefully. "That's dangerous history to uncover," she said quietly. Thomas gave a small, tired smile. "Dangerous for who?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the cellar door at the far end of the room. "For anyone who doesn't want it remembered." That answer sat between them for a moment, because even though the Civil War had ended 6 years earlier, the people who once enforced those laws still lived in towns like Grover's Landing. Families, landowners, former patrolmen, men who might not appreciate their land being connected to a network that helped enslaved people escape. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "You said the tunnel had been sealed." "Yes." "From the inside?" "Yes." "Then whoever closed it knew about the chamber." Thomas nodded. "And they wanted to erase it." The lantern flame flickered softly. Eleanor spoke again, more quietly now. "Do you know what happened to the man who built it?" Thomas looked down at the open book. "Not yet." She studied his face carefully. "But you're going to find out." It wasn't a question. Thomas closed the ledger. "Yes." Eleanor sighed softly. Then she said something that stayed with him long after she returned to bed. "Just remember something, Thomas." "What?" "People who build places like that chamber," she gestured toward the floor beneath them, "don't usually disappear peacefully." The room grew quiet again. Thomas sat there alone with the record book and the fading lantern light. And for the first time since discovering the tunnel, a darker possibility entered his mind. What if Cornelius Webb hadn't simply vanished from history? What if the reason the chamber had been sealed was because someone had caught him using it? And if that were true, then somewhere in the valley there might still be traces of the night everything ended. The night the Daltrey estate stopped being a station on a hidden path to freedom and became a buried secret. And if Thomas kept digging, he might discover exactly how that happened.
The next morning, Thomas returned to the valley, carrying only a small satchel. The fog still clung to the trees, heavy and damp, curling around the roots like fingers. Each step he took along the familiar path toward the old riverbank felt slower, weighted, as if the ground remembered the people who had passed through it long before him. He stopped at the spot where the hidden tunnel entrance had been. The earth was solid now, the entrance entirely sealed with planks and stone. The ground looked undisturbed, but Thomas had learned not to trust appearances. He set down his satchel and took out a small trowel. Digging cautiously, he brushed aside the soil near the edge of the floorboards. There, barely visible, was a faint carving, a set of initials worn by time. C.W. Thomas's heart beat faster. Cornelius Webb. He traced the initials with his finger. A shiver ran down his spine. Suddenly, a snap echoed through the trees behind him. Thomas froze. A figure emerged from the fog, a man tall and thin, wearing a long coat, face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't speak, but his eyes locked onto Thomas with unnerving intensity. Thomas instinctively grabbed his satchel and stepped back. Who are you?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether to answer. Then he spoke in a low, controlled voice. "You shouldn't be here." Thomas's mind raced. "Why? This land, it's private property. I have a right to—" "Rights don't matter, not when history is alive beneath your feet." Thomas clenched his jaw. "History? You mean the tunnel?" The man's gaze flicked to the sealed floorboards. "Yes, you've stirred something that's been buried for decades." Thomas swallowed hard. "Who are you?" The man stepped closer. "Someone who remembers, someone who knows what happens to those who dig too deep." A wind stirred through the valley, carrying the scent of wet earth and decay. Thomas felt a cold certainty settle over him. This was no ordinary warning. He backed up slowly, eyes scanning the forest. "What do you want from me?" The man's voice dropped even lower. "I want you to stop before you uncover what should never see the light of day." Thomas's hand tightened on the trowel. "And if I don't?" The figure paused, then said, almost whispering, "Then you'll know why Cornelius Webb disappeared." Before Thomas could respond, the man turned and vanished into the fog, leaving nothing behind but the soft rustle of leaves. Thomas stood frozen, staring at the sealed floorboards. The ledger, the tunnel, Cornelius Webb, everything pointed toward a truth someone had fought desperately to bury. And now, Thomas realized, he was the only one left who could uncover it. But with that knowledge came a darker question. How much of the past would survive his digging, and how much would fight back? Thomas returned to the house in silence, the weight of the stranger's warning pressing against his chest like iron. He told no one, not Elenina, not the laborers, not even old Pratt. Some truths, he knew, carried consequences that could not be undone once spoken. That evening he sat at the kitchen table with his lantern casting flickering shadows across the walls. The satchel was open, revealing a collection of papers, small trinkets, and the faint imprint of something older, something that belonged to the tunnel's original inhabitants. He traced each object with care, feeling a chill as his fingers brushed the edge of a folded piece of paper, stiff with age. The child's jacket, faded but intact, seemed almost to breathe beneath his touch. A headscarf, frayed and thin, still retained the ghost of a smell, smoke, wood, and something else he couldn't name. He knew, without understanding how, that these objects had been deliberately preserved, placed with intention by those who had used the hidden space. Thomas felt a presence behind the closed door of the house, as if the walls themselves remembered. Every creak in the timber, every sigh of the settling floorboards carried the weight of unseen eyes. He remembered old Pratt's words about Gerald Daltrey, about the men who watched the property, and about Cornelius Webb.
The same sense of unseen surveillance that had kept people silent for decades now pressed down upon him. He realized that this hidden history was not simply a secret of the past, it was a living thing. It had teeth, it had memory, and it had rules that outsiders did not understand. As night fell, Thomas reviewed the property records again. The 1851 annotation of the lower-level improvements no longer seemed like a minor clerical note. It was a breadcrumb, left intentionally or overlooked, pointing to something the world had been instructed not to find. A flicker of movement caught his eye at the edge of the room, a shadow too precise to be a trick of the lantern. Thomas stiffened, heart hammering. He whispered to himself, "We were here. If you find this, we were here. Remember us." The words replayed in his mind like a chant, a warning and an invocation simultaneously. The people who had hidden below had left a record of their existence, but they had also left something else, a message encoded in fear, in secrecy, in the careful preservation of their world beneath the earth. Thomas understood now that opening the tunnel was not just discovery, it was a crossing. Once the wall came down, there would be no turning back. He placed the objects carefully in the satchel, his hands trembling slightly. Tomorrow he would gather the men and they would break the seal. But even as he planned, a thought rooted itself deep in his mind. The moment you disturb something forbidden, the thing you uncover begins to watch you, and sometimes it waits.
Morning came with an almost violent clarity, the kind that made the air feel sharp against the skin. Thomas met old Pratt at the edge of the cellar, lantern in hand. The old man's face was unreadable, but the set of his shoulders carried the memory of decades spent guarding truths that were never meant to surface. "Today," Thomas said quietly, "we see it." They descended into the cellar together, the smell of damp stone and ancient earth filling their lungs. Each step echoed as if the house itself whispered warnings, carrying the memories of those who had walked here long before Thomas's time. The others arrived shortly after, the team assembled, each man carrying tools, lanterns, and a sense of anticipation that bordered on dread. The brick wall loomed at the end of the passage, its surface neat, deliberate, and oppressively final. Abel Hult knelt first, examining the mortar and running his fingers along the bricks. "It was built from the other side," he said. The words hung in the cold air, and Thomas felt a tightening in his chest. "Yes," Thomas replied. "Someone sealed themselves in, or something out." Slowly, methodically, the men began removing the top course of bricks. Dust rose in small clouds, filling the passage with a haze that felt almost sacred. Each brick released a whisper of history, a fragment of the lives that had occupied the space for years. The air grew heavier, dense with the weight of expectation and fear. As the opening widened, Thomas raised the lantern and shone it into the room beyond. The smell hit him first, old, mineralized, layered with the passage of decades, carrying the faintest undertone of decay and desperation. It was a smell that spoke of time itself, a record of what had been lived, hidden and forgotten. Then the light revealed the space. Rough timber shored walls, low ceilings, platforms built from scavenged wood, shelves still holding objects, clay jugs, folded cloths, and small personal effects, each item a fragment of someone's existence, preserved with obsessive care. Thomas's hands trembled as he stepped closer. He noticed the child's jacket again, delicate and impossibly fragile. A headscarf, stiffened with age, lay beside it. A folded piece of paper, wedged between the jug and the wall, caught his eye. The handwriting was urgent, larger than the careful script of the book. Thomas could barely believe the message he saw. A name, a date, and a single line beneath it. He read it twice, aloud in a whisper that barely stirred the stagnant air. "We were here. If you find this, we were here. Remember us." The room was silent after that. Not just quiet, but a silence that pressed against the ears, a reminder that some knowledge demanded stillness, demanded reverence, demanded that it not be broken too soon. Thomas realized in that moment that the history of this place was not just a story, it was a warning, and he understood fully that once you enter the world beneath the earth never forgets.
The weight of that message hung over Thomas like a physical presence, pressing down, demanding comprehension before action. He looked at the others, Ned, Rufus, Abel, and old Pratt, and saw the same mixture of awe, fear, and an unspoken understanding that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The air in the chamber seemed to hum, as if the walls themselves remembered every footstep, every whisper, every breath that had ever passed through this secret hollow. Old Pratt stepped forward, his boots silent on the compacted earth floor. He crouched beside the platforms, examining the small jacket, the headscarf, the other objects, with a reverence that went beyond mere curiosity. "Long enough," he said quietly, almost to himself, "long enough that the living have forgotten, and only the hidden remember." His eyes met Thomas's, and Thomas saw the recognition there, the acknowledgement that what they were confronting was not simply history, but a form of power, the kind that manipulates the living from the shadows, that bends communities, families, and even the natural world to its will. Thomas understood instinctively that this wasn't merely a secret passage or a hidden room. It was a controlled space, a deliberately constructed environment designed to conceal, to protect, and perhaps to imprison. The platforms suggested habitation, but who had lived here? Children? Adults? People seeking escape? Or people forced into hiding by forces that were older and darker than any local law? Every object told a story, every piece of wood and stone a fragment of a life that had been deliberately erased from memory. Abel reached for the folded piece of paper again, gently holding it between his hands as if it might shatter at any moment. The script was urgent, nearly frantic in tone. Whoever had written this understood that time would erode memory, that the passage of decades would bury truth under routine and denial. Thomas's mind raced, connecting dots that had no clear pattern, yet seemed to outline something immense, a system of concealment that had endured for generations. "You need to be careful," old Pratt said finally, breaking the silence. "There are people and institutions that have invested in this forgetting. They don't want anyone to know, and they have ways of ensuring that the walls of history remain unbroken." His voice was low, gravelly, and carried the authority of someone who had seen, early in life, how ordinary people became complicit in extraordinary concealments. Thomas nodded slowly. He understood now that what they had uncovered was not simply a local mystery, a forgotten family secret, or even a piece of Civil War-era curiosity. This was a hidden network of influence, a psychological and spatial control system built into the land itself, waiting for someone like him to stumble upon it. Every detail, the careful brickwork, the platforms, the personal effects, even the odor of decades-old earth, was a signal, a record, a warning. He turned to the group. "We have to document everything," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "Every object, every note, every scrap of memory. And we must understand what it means, who put it here, and why. This is bigger than any of us imagined. But first," he paused, holding up the folded paper, "we must honor them, those who left their trace, who survived this hidden life, who trusted that someone would find them." The men nodded silently, aware that in that cold, dark chamber, the rules of the surface world no longer applied. Here, they were witnesses,
And witnesses are the first line of responsibility when hidden truths demand recognition. Thomas carefully unfolded the paper once more, letting the dim light of the lantern catch the faint pencil marks, the edges frayed with age. The words were simple, almost understated. We were here. If you find this, we were here. Remember us. But simplicity rarely masks truth in these hidden spaces. There was an urgency to the lettering, a quiet defiance. Someone had taken care to survive invisibly, to mark their existence in a way that could reach across decades. And now, Thomas realized that message had reached him. He looked around the room again, eyes tracing the shadows cast by lantern light over the rough timber framing. The platforms, the shelves, the worn clay jug, all of it was deliberate, intentional, constructed with a purpose he could not yet fully grasp. This was not abandonment, it was preservation. Every object, every structural choice, every artifact whispered a story of survival under pressure, of secrecy maintained across generations, a kind of wisdom hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right person to unlock it. Old Pratt stepped closer, his expression a mixture of curiosity and caution. The people who came before, they understood something fundamental, he murmured. Not about wealth or land or law. They understood power, how it moves unseen, how it bends minds and communities, how it controls what is remembered and what is forgotten. They left this as proof that even in hiding, knowledge survives. Thomas's mind raced. He had always thought of history as something recorded in ink, in stone, in public memory. But here, beneath the Virginia earth, he saw another kind of history, a living history, embedded in space, maintained through secrecy, disciplined by fear and necessity. These people had engineered invisibility. They had constructed an environment designed to shield themselves from the outside world, from authority, from notice. And now, by chance or fate, Thomas and his team had stepped into that hidden system. He turned to Ned and Abel, who had been quietly observing. Every piece we find, every note, every artifact, it's a key, he said, voice low, commanding attention. Keys to understanding the structure of their survival, the psychology behind it, the power they had to manipulate their own reality. We need to treat this seriously, methodically, and with respect. One wrong move, one careless word, and the whole system could collapse. The secrets could vanish, or worse, strike back. Old Pratt nodded, the flickering lantern light carving his face into sharp shadows. And there are those who don't want anyone to look too closely, he said. Even today, those shadows have ears and eyes. The land remembers more than you think. His words settled heavily on Thomas's shoulders, a weight that matched the cold earth and the centuries of silence in the room. Thomas inhaled, steadying himself. We'll start with everything in this room, he said, gesturing to the shelves and the platforms. Document, record, preserve. Then we trace the origins, the builders, the timeline, the purpose, and we will go deeper. There is another layer beneath this layer, I can feel it, something older, something that stretches farther than anyone in town could imagine. Abel shifted uneasily. Are we ready for that? He asked, the question barely above a whisper. Thomas's eyes met his. We don't have a choice, not if we want the truth, and once you see the truth, you can never unsee it.
The following morning, Thomas arrived before anyone else. The mist still hung low over the hills, clinging to the oak and cedar like a secret waiting to be breathed in. Old Pratt appeared shortly after, tools in hand, and Thomas intercepted him before he could ascend the porch. I need you to tell me what you know, he said, voice firm but measured. Not what you suspect, what you know. Old Pratt set his tools down, his eyes narrowing as he regarded Thomas. The silence stretched,
punctuated only by the faint rustle of leaves and the distant crow of a rooster. Then he spoke, slowly, deliberately. 40 years is a long time, he said. There are things I saw, things I was told, and things I only figured out much later. I'm not sure where the lines are anymore. Start wherever makes sense to you. Thomas nodded, settling beside him on the worn steps. The morning sun had barely crested the ridge, and the heat had yet to touch the ground. Old Pratt's voice was a low hum against the awakening world. Gerald Daltrey came to this valley in 1828 with money he never fully accounted for, bought land that other men wanted, built his house on the best rise for miles, respected because he was wealthy, careful about who he offended. But there were people in this county who knew things about him they did not speak of openly. Speaking openly had consequences. Thomas leaned forward, sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. Old Pratt paused, searching Thomas's face for understanding. I was born here. My father worked timber on Daltrey land in the 1840s. I was young, 15 or 16, but I worked alongside him for 2 summers. They were parts of the estate we weren't supposed to go. Not the house itself, but certain outbuildings, areas near the tree line to the north. Daltrey had men watching the perimeter at night, his own men, not the sheriff, not anyone official, his own. The air grew heavier, the heat of anticipation pressing against them. Thomas understood. This was more than a story of land or architecture. This was an echo of control, of a hidden system of surveillance and power stretching across generations. Old Pratt continued, voice even but firm. In those years, men used this part of Virginia as a route going north. You understand what I mean? Thomas's stomach tightened. I understand, he said. He felt it, the calculated geometry of the land, the strategic positioning of the estate, the invisible channels of movement only a few could exploit. The old man's words sank deep. The Daltrey property was not merely a house, it was a tool, a mechanism, a lens through which control, secrecy, and fear were exercised. And the passage? Thomas asked quietly. The brick wall? The old man's eyes remained fixed on the horizon. Built later, possibly Henry, possibly someone else, but the original passage, my father told me when he was old and didn't care who heard, that he had heard things in the night, sounds from underground. He never spoke of it to anyone, not a soul. Thomas turned toward the north slope, the tree line dark against the early light, feeling the weight of that revelation. The tunnel was not an anomaly. It was part of a structure he had only just begun to comprehend, a network of secrecy, surveillance, and invisible history that had shaped the land and the people in ways no record could fully capture. He inhaled, steadying himself. We'll find the second opening. We have to. Old Pratt's gaze shifted slightly east. There's a formation of rock in the old growth, a flat outcropping, cedar growing against it. You wouldn't see it unless you knew to look. I've never gone close, don't know for certain. Thomas's mind raced, connecting dots, the brick wall, Agnes Daltrey's words, the 1851 property records, and now a hidden exit, older than any of them realized. Then we open it, he said, voice resolute. Old Pratt looked at him, shadowed by the morning sun. I know, he said. Will you be there? Yes, replied Thomas, feeling the pull of inevitability.
By late afternoon, Thomas and old Pratt stood at the edge of the north tree line, where the cedar grew thick and the rock outcropping old Pratt had described jutted from the earth like a slanted sentinel. The forest around them was silent, almost reverent. The sunlight filtered through layers of green, painting everything in mottled gold. Thomas crouched beside the rock, tracing his fingers along its surface. There were faint grooves, worn smooth by what? Time? Tools? He couldn't yet tell. "This is it," old Pratt whispered. "If the opening's here, it's been here for generations. Might have been used for a dozen things, or no one." Thomas's heart beat faster. He probed the edges with a stick first, careful. There was a depression, just wide enough for a hand to slip into. He pressed further, and the stick hit hollow wood beneath the rock, a crude covering, likely hidden to avoid notice. "I see it," he murmured, excitement and caution tangled in his voice. Old Pratt crouched beside him, peering into the shadowed cavity. "Don't know what you'll find," he said. "Might be just a shaft, might be tunnels, might be." He let the sentence hang, and Thomas understood. History, secrets, and danger all mingled in that dark space. With deliberate care, Thomas removed the wood, revealing a narrow passage just tall enough for a grown man to squeeze through. The air that escaped smelled of earth, moisture, and something older, an odor that seemed almost alive with memory. Thomas knelt at the edge, flashlight in hand, peering into the darkness. The beam illuminated rough-hewn stone walls, uneven but purposeful, disappearing into the black beyond. "This is it," he said, breath tight with awe. "The Daltrey Passage." Old Pratt nodded slowly. "Keep your wits. Whatever's down there, it's been waiting." Thomas glanced back toward the estate, the fading light casting long shadows across the rolling hills. A shiver ran down his spine, not of cold, but of anticipation. Every step into that tunnel would be a step into the past, into the calculations, fears, and secrets of people long gone. He took a deep breath, tightened his pack, and prepared to enter. The tunnel yawned before him, a threshold between the known and the hidden, promising revelations that could rewrite everything he thought he understood about the Daltrey estate, and possibly himself. As he stepped forward, the weight of history pressed around him, and the last light of day faded into the black of the passage, swallowing him whole. The moment Thomas's foot crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped sharply. It wasn't a chill of air moving through the earth. It was something heavier, something that pressed against his chest, as if the walls themselves were aware of his presence. Each step echoed softly, a hollow tap that seemed to stretch into eternity, bouncing off the stone and timber in a rhythm that made his pulse quicken. The passage narrowed slightly after the first few feet, forcing him to duck under rough timber supports. The smell of age, of mineralized decay, grew stronger. Dust, rot, something like iron, like old blood. It made his stomach tighten, but he pushed forward. Old Pratt followed, close behind, moving with the careful assurance of someone who had been warned, someone who knew that rushing would be fatal, not physically, but mentally, spiritually. They passed a series of small recesses, shallow alcoves that had clearly been used for storage. The timber framing was crude but deliberate, worn smooth along the edges where hands had gripped it, where bodies had pressed against it in darkness. Thomas's mind tried to catalog every detail, the indentations in the walls, the grooves in the floor, the irregularity of the stones. Each mark whispered a story, a fragment of the lives that had once existed in this hidden space. "You feel that?" Old Pratt's voice was a low murmur, almost drowned by the sound of their boots. "It's like the tunnel remembers." Thomas swallowed. He did feel it. Every surface seemed to hum with memory. A subtle vibration, almost imperceptible, ran through the air and into his bones. The farther they went, the stronger it became, as if the tunnel itself was alive with the experiences it had witnessed, as if it resented their intrusion. Then, suddenly, the passage opened into a larger chamber. The air was denser here, the darkness thicker. Thomas raised his lantern, and the light revealed a roughly rectangular room framed in old timber like a coffin within the earth. The walls bore markings, scratches, faint but deliberate, as if someone had tried to communicate in silence. On the floor were remnants of a life hidden away, fragments of cloth, shards of pottery, a small iron key lying atop a mound of dust. Thomas bent over the key, feeling its weight, the coldness of it. He realized with a jolt that he had crossed not just a threshold in space, but in time. Every object here was a message from the past, preserved in the darkness, deliberately hidden, waiting for discovery. Old Pratt stepped forward, placing his hand on Thomas's shoulder. "This room," he said quietly, "it's more than a hiding place. It's a record. Someone wanted it to survive. Someone wanted to be remembered. And now it's our turn to see it." Thomas exhaled slowly, the gravity of that realization pressing down like the earth above them. Every secret in this chamber would demand attention, scrutiny, and courage. And somewhere, deep in the darkness beyond the lantern's reach, there were still more truths waiting to reveal themselves, truths that would change everything. Thomas moved carefully through the chamber, each step measured, each breath shallow, as if disturbing the air too forcefully might wake whatever memories were trapped here. The lantern light trembled over the timber supports, revealing more objects: a broken chair, a child's small shoes, a bundle of cloth tied with a faded ribbon. Each item was a whisper, a fragment of a life hidden deliberately, pressed into the earth to avoid discovery, yet preserved with a precision that spoke of intention, not neglect. He knelt by the bundle of cloth, lifting it gently. Inside were more pieces of clothing, delicate and fragile, a woman's shift and a child's vest. The fabric, though brittle, had survived decades underground, untouched by sunlight, untouched by wind. Thomas ran his fingers over the thread, feeling the care that had gone into making these garments. Whoever had hidden them had believed they would be found, but not just anyone, only by someone patient, someone deliberate, someone who could bear the weight of truth. Old Pratt crouched beside him, eyes scanning the corners of the room. "This was no accident," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "Everything here was placed, every mark, every crease in the cloth, even the way the shelves lean. It's a message, not in words, but in arrangement. They wanted someone to understand, to see what the surface world would not allow." Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing the enormity of it. This room was more than a hidden chamber. It was a time capsule, a monument to lives forced underground by fear, by power, by decisions made above without conscience. The thought pressed down on him with the weight of centuries. How many other secrets like this had been buried, not in the earth, but in silence? How many truths had been suppressed because the wrong people held the power to decide what should be remembered and what should be erased? He turned to old Pratt. "Who were they hiding from?" he asked. The old man hesitated, his gaze distant. "Not one person," he said finally. "The whole system, the laws, the landowners, the eyes that watched and judged. These people, whatever they were, knew that if the world above found them, it would destroy them. So they built this place. They built it to survive history itself." Thomas's fingers brushed over a small leather-bound book on the shelf. Its cover was swollen with age, but intact. He lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of the centuries pressing through the leather, the paper, the ink. Every line within it would be a story, a truth hidden, a life erased from memory but now poised to return. He realized then that discovering this tunnel was not just a matter of curiosity or adventure. It was a confrontation with the very nature of power, secrecy, and survival, and it demanded a choice: to expose, to remember, or to walk away, leaving history buried where it had tried to hide. The chamber seemed to hum in response, the darkness pressing against him like a living thing, waiting for his decision. And in that moment, Thomas understood that once he opened this door, nothing would ever be the same.